Hello, this lecture is going to focus on talk in the classroom and early literacy. Talk is happening all of the time in the classroom, and as teachers we really need to make sure that it is not always us who are doing all of the talking. We need to provide ample opportunities for students to talk with each other. Social constructivist teachers allow time so that students can build their knowledge together, and much of this learning is facilitated by talking with each other. Talk in the classroom can be a sensitive topic for some students because each student will have a different comfort level when it comes to talking. It is our job as teachers to provide a safe and nurturing environment to help students feel comfortable talking. It is important to say to students that the classroom is a safe place where everyone is free to share his or her opinion without ridicule or negative outcomes. Often students feel uncomfortable making presentations to the class, but if you prepare them properly, by teaching them strategies, by providing support and guidance, and by giving lots of time to practice, talking in front of the class should be an experience that all students will embrace with confidence. When children enter school, they've already learned about the 4 language cueing systems through their natural immersion in language. Children are making sense of language in the context of their everyday lives and experiences. Donaldson's research described in your textbook reminds us that children learn best if introduced to new concepts by working with concrete objects in the context of familiar situations. The example from your textbook was learning fractions through cutting pizzas or apples. As children get older, they don't need to embed their new learning in familiar context as much as they did when they were younger. Children still learn best by using language for real purposes. I want you to think about some real uses of language that you can predict using think about using in your classroom. Some examples might be writing real letters to real people, reading books for information, and I want you to think about if maybe you can come up with some of your own. Language development in elementary school, talking and listening. Talking and listening always function together and occur in a social context. Talk is an important part of communication, thinking, and learning. Your textbook does a very nice job of describing talking and listening in the classroom, but I want to just briefly touch on some of the major concepts and terms. Exploratory talk is when children reflect on their learning through talking, conversations, problem-solving, and questioning. It is usually spontaneous and is in response to what they are currently involved with. It is also collaborative and socially constructed. There are 4 types of listening that your textbook describes. Aesthetic listening is listening for pleasure, and efferent listening is listening for a purpose, like for example listening to gain information. Critical listening involves assessing what is heard, making judgments about the situation, and attempting to understand both sides of a debate. Active listening is when students are participating in listening in groups such as writing conferences, group projects, drama, or shared reading. Students develop listening skills best when they are given real opportunities to practice their listening. Before we move on to talking about early literacy, what I want you to do is just quickly think about your teaching philosophy. When you have you can either pause the screencast and go to it now, or after you're done listening, I want you to go to it and add some thoughts on how children learn and develop their language. Keep in mind what you learned about Halliday and the 7 functions of language. You may also want to add something on the 6 language arts and perhaps something about social constructivism. So moving on to early literacy. What you see on the screen is called a Venn diagram, and this is a graphic organizer that can help students to think more analytically and to help them structure their information. What it is a way to compare 2 different concepts. In this case, what you will be doing is comparing emergent literacy and early literacy. In the 2 big areas of each circle, you will be writing down information that is specific to each one of those terms. For example, on the left, you would write down everything that is specific just to emergent literacy. On the right, in the right circle, the big part, you would write down everything specific to early literacy. And in the section that that is a little bit darker where the two circles overlap, you would write things that are common to both. It's a way to compare and contrast similarities and differences between two concepts. What I want you to do is turn in your textbook to page 74 and 75, and you will see the information presented there about emergent literacy and early literacy. And I want you to practice using the Venn diagram to compare these two concepts. Emergent literacy was a term coined by Marie Clay. Prior to Clay's discovery, the common belief was that children began their literacy learning at school. Clay's observations suggested that children come to school with existing knowledge about print literacy from their early experiences at home. Early literacy also recognizes that children come to school having had many experiences with literacy at home, but it focuses on all the language arts, not just print literacy. So what I would like you to do is to pause the screencast and take an opportunity to compare these two concepts. As we move on, I want to show you a more complex Venn diagram. This is comparing three different concepts. What you can do is then compare, or you can look at the differences between each concept, you can look at the similarities between two of the concepts, and you can also, in the very center of the circle, look at similarities between all three of the concepts. A little bit more complex and requires a higher level of thinking. What I would like to do is move on to the oral language-print relationship. Children need to learn that there is a difference between print and pictures. Often children attend only to the pictures in a book, and you need to help them recognize that the words on the page are what you are saying to tell the story. This can be something you talk about at times, for example, saying, "These words say," or demonstrate by pointing to the words on the page as you read, and that's called tracking. You can usually tell when children make the transition to recognizing print because they start to point out the words or ask questions about the text on the page and not just the pictures. Some children come to school with limited experience with books. You may need to teach them how to open a book, how to read a book from left to right and from top to bottom, and this is called directionality. Also, to improve the oral language print relationship, you need to teach children about, or you need to increase children's metalinguistic knowledge, and that means giving them experiences to understand the terms about reading and writing. For example, words such as sound or beginning of the word, sentence, letter, author, cover, all of those words increase their metalinguistic language. Might be wondering, I'm noticing here the www, that was a word that I was thinking that you would like to, that I would have you add to your word wall word, but we'll talk about that another time. I want to also spend a moment talking about the key phonemic awareness skills. And this is to help increase phonological awareness. Some of the things that you will need to focus on it during the early literacy stage is recognizing rhymes, recognizing when words begin with or contain the same sound, generating words that begin with or contain the same sounds, generating words by blending sounds together, segmenting sounds within words, and playing with the sounds in words by substituting, adding, or deleting sounds to create new words. We're going to move on to assessment. We've not discussed assessment so far, so I want to begin with a brief overview. Assessment means evaluation. Your textbook defines assessment as the collecting and analyzing of information about students to help make decisions about what they know, value, and are able to do. The end goal of assessment is to inform future decisions about instruction. There are many types of assessment. Types of assessment can be divided into categories such as formal and informal, assessment of learning and assessment for learning, or summative and formative. Formal assessment tends to include assessments such as standardized tests and exams. They often have a standard procedure for how they are administered, how much time is given, and how to score the test. They also often have a standard grade levels and are norm referenced or criterion referenced. Usually the word test in schools means it's going to be a formal assessment. Informal assessment is occurring all of the time in schools. It is what teachers base their daily lessons on so they can plan in response to what is observed or gained from the assessment. There are times when our informal assessment is not recorded, but we often use what we learn to guide our instructional decisions. Informal assessments can be simple and basic methods for instant feedback for both the teacher and the student. For teachers, informal assessment can provide information about how to improve the quality and effectiveness of the lesson, in addition to learning about how students are progressing in the classroom. There are 4 major types of informal assessment: observation, interviews, samples of work, and self-assessment. Observations can be planned or unplanned. For example, a teacher might create a checklist of things to observe, or plan to write anecdotal notes, which are planned observations, or simply walk around the room and glance at what students are doing. Both types of observations can provide useful information on the lesson and on the student's understanding. I have included an activity called the Kid Watching activity for you to test out your observation skills. You can download the checklist and then proceed to watch the video and see how much you can observe using the checklist and watching the girl reading. Sometimes teachers create their own checklists of items to observe based on curricular objectives. You can also record observations on post-it notes and put them in students' folders. Sometimes it helps to create duotangs or observation files for each student that you can grab quickly when you have some one-on-one time to observe the student. The other types of informal assessment, interviews, samples of children work, and self-assessment are described clearly in your textbook. Take some time to look at the samples of work included there. I also talked earlier about assessment for learning and assessment of learning, and formative and summative assessment. We will talk more about these terms in our class on assessment. The next part of this lecture is going to be a screencast on balanced instruction, experiences that facilitate literacy development. So make sure that you also see the second part of this lecture.